Welcome to the Holistic Matters podcast, sponsored by Standard Process. Standard Process is a trusted brand at the forefront of high-quality, whole food-based nutritional supplements. Visit holisticmatters.com for a wide range of holistic health content, including articles, videos, continuing education, and more to keep you up to date on the latest nutrition science and herbal health trends. I'm today's host, Dr. Dana Parent, naturopathic doctor and Standard Process clinical educator. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Dana Parent, and I'm here with you today from the Holistic Matters podcast. I'm so excited to be joined by Jack DuBois. He's an exceptional leader. He has some exceptional skills that he's going to share with us today, especially as it relates to regenerative farming practices. So let me just introduce my guest today. Jack DuBois is part of the fourth generation of family leadership at Standard Process. He's a dedicated professional with a diverse background in agriculture and sales, and he earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and has worked on innovative projects to enhance soil health, boost crop health, and promote biodiversity on the Standard Process organic farm. And Jack has really become an expert in regenerative farming and crop development, which is the foundation of the effective nutritional support that Standard Process is really known for. And he's especially passionate about educating healthcare practitioners on the benefits of regenerative agriculture and whole foods, and really how that translates into improved patient health outcomes. So welcome, Jack. We're so excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Parent. Really excited to be here. And this is absolutely one of my favorite topics to talk about. So it always gets me fired up. And it's always amazing, how many people are really receptive in this day and age to this story and how many people are really interested in regenerative agriculture. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's start at the beginning, right? I was just reading that less than 10% of Americans actually know what regenerative agriculture is or what it means. Take it away. What is regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in this day and age, it's kind of hotly contested, right? And there's a lot of different definitions for what regenerative and sustainable is. Those are definitely two terms that have gotten really popular and lots of people are throwing them around. I mean, who doesn't want to be regenerative and sustainable? But I think at the end of the day, I always say if you ask 100 different farmers what regenerative agriculture is, you're going to get 100 different definitions, right? And yeah. I think to us, it's really, to me, in the simplest definition is, are you giving back more to the soil than you're taking away, right? Are you leaving that as a living system better than when you found it? And it's pretty clear to see, on most of the ground across the U.S. that we are degrading it over time, right? We are not leaving it in a better spot than we got it. So I think, from a soil testing perspective, are you improving organic matter and cation exchange capacity, micro, macro minerals? Are yields increasing without really increasing fertility inputs? And so that's really, soil till, things like that, right? Are you leaving the soil in a better place than you found it? That's, I think, really the basis of regenerative, sustainable agriculture.
Yes, it's a practice of agriculture where you're really focused on improving the environment and improving the soil and therefore improving the crop, right? Or the plant.
Yeah, absolutely. The soil really is the foundation for providing nutritious crops and sustaining human life, right? And so I think a lot of times, people think about soil as like a natural resource to be exploited, right? I think very few people think of the soil as a living system, right? Many disregard, the microbiome of the soil. I think that's really something that we can put more focus on now and really see it as a living system. I should know the quote for this podcast, but Dr. Mark Hyman actually talks about like how many microbes are in a teaspoon of soil, right? And compares that to like how much biology is in the human body. And it's really amazing when you look at soil as a living system and look at all the biology that's in just a teaspoon of soil and how really we should be looking at how we're feeding that instead of how we're growing crops and increasing yield and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know I've seen this really beautiful image where they have an intestines, right? And a stomach and basically the microbiome in human and the diversity. And You don't really think about that, but plants need that same microbial diversity in order to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I work with, a lot of healthcare practitioners and, telling this story of regenerative agriculture. And usually that's, how I relate it to their story, right? They're dealing with the human body all day long and they're dealing with the issues in the gut and the microbiome and those imbalances and those effects of synthetics and chemicals and stuff like that and degrading a lot of those microbes. And you can also look at the soil that way too. And so that's a really great point. I think I know which image you're talking about, and it's really a great way to kind of make that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a step back, so this regenerative agriculture, I think a lot of people know and understand, or maybe they don't, what happens with just modern agricultural practices. So can you kind of do a compare and contrast? How does regenerative agriculture differ?
Sure. Conventionally, agriculture has become a big business like any other. So we've really put a lot of focus improving yield and breeding crops for hundreds of years for higher yield and higher uniformity and stuff like that, because, your average farmer is paid from pounds across the scale, right? They're not paid on nutrient density. There's actually never been an incentive to grow or breed a crop with higher nutritional value. And that's pretty scary. I think most people think, well, I just have to eat whole foods, right? And the fact of the matter is, and it's not necessarily a farmer's fault, right? Or a seed breeder's fault, because that's where the incentive has been and that's where the dollars are. And we aren't incentivizing the maximizing of nutritional value, generally in the agricultural industry today. So really, a lot of these crops have been genetically modified, but also bred to have that high yielding value. And so when you look at a lot of those ancient varieties, they have a lot higher nutrient density. But the other thing that comes along with that is the effectiveness and the efficiency of farming as well. And not just, the GMOs, but also this huge use of glyphosate and Roundup and other pesticides and insecticides to really control the crops and damage to them via insects and diseases and things like that. Really, you have the wide usage of that. I mean, when you look over time, we've just increased that so much since glyphosate first came out. And so a lot of people are reliant on that for weed management on farms, and very few people cultivate their soil anymore and actually plant their crops and actually have to work the soil to kill the crops naturally. They're reliant on these chemical ways and applications of farming. The other thing that's gotten really popular is, synthetic forms of nitrogen, petroleum-based fertilizers and things like that. So those have been massively produced. And I think that's kind of been used in the conventional agricultural industry to mask soil depletion, right? We're losing so many nutrients in the soil naturally, but we're not replenishing that. So to get back to like my original point, right, we're not looking at giving back more to the soil than we're taking away. And so we're kind of forced into this system of our soil is degrading. How can we really bring back some of this yield? And the ways that we're doing it right now are mostly in the synthetic realm and using petroleum-based fertilizers and things like that to sustain the crop. That's really, I think, the scary reality that we find ourselves in today through conventional agriculture. Regenerative agriculture, it's not one and the same as organic agriculture, but I think a lot more organic farms are regenerative. That's really focused on getting away from the genetic modification, the heavy synthetics, the heavy pesticide use, and being free of that. So that's where I think the world really needs to go. And people ask me, how do we create more of these organic farms? And really, people have to start voting with their dollar. Until people go to the store and only buy organic produce, that's when we're going to be forced as farmers really to get back to more organic agriculture and less conventional.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack there. I have so many questions. You mentioned regenerative and organic. So are those two different type of farming practices? I mean, does organic mean something different than regenerative?
Yeah, good question. Like I said, I think most organic farmers are a little bit more regenerative minded, but they are two different things for sure. Organically, if you're organic certified, you're required to have no pesticides, no fungicides, no petroleum-based fertility inputs, and no genetic modification, right? And those are some of the frameworks for being organic. And you can be, somewhat sustainable without being fully organic. And you can be organic without really being sustainable either. If you follow all those requirements, but you're still focused on mass producing crops, then you're probably less focused on, regenerating your soils. on our farm, the three big ways that we give back to the soil more than we take away from it are through cover cropping, crop rotation, and composting. Those are three of our biggest ways that we can really give back in a regenerative standpoint to our soil, in addition to the organic principles that we hold true. So they're definitely two different things. But I think a lot of times, at least on our farm, it helps us to be organic, definitely helps us to be more regenerative. But there's a lot more to regenerative agriculture than just living by those frameworks.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is kind of in your practices and in your experience, you've farmed organically and it's a regenerative farm and it's a sustainable farm. So really your kind of experience has been this high level experience in terms of farming practices.
Yeah. And I'll say too, is we are certified by MOSA and inspected by MOSA. And that's an organic certifier that we use in Wisconsin. And they also encourage a lot of these like more regenerative, sustainable approaches to improving the entire ecosystem, right? Whether that be, grass waterways that help from having soil and topsoil runoff, right? And heavy rainstorms and things like that. And maintaining our tree lines and things like that, where on a lot of farms, they would, wipe out the trees to have more tillable acres. And so, having bird houses and pollinator plots, right? And things like that. And so those are all things that we keep on our farm that really improve and look at the ecosystem more holistically.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a different environment. If you think of a farm, you just think of no trees, no pollinators, just a tractor and some soil and maybe some crops. But I think a lot of times too, I always see the same crop. If I'm driving by a farm, I just see one crop in one area and kind of one part of the country. Can you speak to that? I mean, does regenerative mean, you're regenerating multiple different crops, or is it just one crop you're working with?
I love that. One of the things I always say is like God didn't make the soil to grow one crop on it all the time, right? He made the soil as a diverse ecosystem, many different varieties of crops living together, one with the soil. We have the unique opportunity on our farm to grow 20 to 30 different crops a year. And so most farms, I think, are probably closer to that, like 2 to 3 different crops. Our neighbor has been growing corn on his ground for over 30 years straight. He's never rotated. For us, crop rotation is really at the heart of a lot of our regenerative practices. And we have a unique opportunity really to diversify, right? Organically, you're actually required to rotate on a 3-year crop cycles. If you plant buckwheat field, you've got to plant beets the next year, right? And pea vine the year after that, right? And so we can't even plant back to back to back. We have really extensive crop rotations, being that we grow 20 to 30 different crops. Our crop rotations are typically closer to the 5 to 7 year range. That really does a few things. Specific crops uptake certain nutrients from the soil, certain minerals and things like that. By really having a diverse crop rotation, you're really sustaining a lot of those compounds for a longer period of time. That is one of the big ways we do it. The other big benefit of that organically, not having the fungicides and things like that as kind of a scapegoat, is it really ensures that we're mitigating our risk for insect and disease damage. Certain insects and diseases have really specific taste. And especially with vegetables, what really likes cabbage moth, that has a very specific taste. And so if you plant the same thing over and over and over again in the same field, you're going to end up losing a crop eventually to an insect or a disease. And so it's been well over 20 years that we've been doing this and having a really extensive crop rotation, and we've never lost a crop to an insect or a disease. Really phenomenal. And I think at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. The proof is there, and this process really works.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose any crops, but you don't think about insects taking out an entire species. You wouldn't think about that if you didn't know about these farming practices.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, too, having 20 to 30 different crops growing on our farm, there's always something for the pollinators to get after. So that's the other really cool thing is we have such a great ecosystem for pollinators because there's always something for them to pollinate.
You've talked a lot about the nutrient content too. I want to kind of focus there for a moment because ultimately soil is the foundation. If you don't have nutrition in the soil, if you don't have those vitamins and minerals, you can't make a nutritious crop. It's very difficult to make something out of nothing, right?
Yeah. And I think when I started learning all this a few years back, That was the most mind-boggling thing. And I mentioned it earlier, right? But there's
Yeah.
just never been an incentive to grow a crop that's more nutritious. And so a lot of times I feel like that is where really soil degradation started and nutrient depletion started. It really all starts in the soil. That is the foundation, right? You have over 50% of the US that's magnesium deficient. And you look at minerals across the board, go down the list, and people are not getting enough of these vital nutrients and minerals. And that all starts in the soil, and it starts in our food. Buckwheat is one of those crops that we grow that's really rich in these compounds like magnesium, and it's got to get that from the soil. And so if your soil is really degraded in magnesium, for example, then you're not going to be able to supply those crops with those nutritious compounds, and you're not going to be able to supply the people consuming them. That's really the scary state. And I mentioned that earlier too. There's some really cool studies out there that have looked at these ancient varieties of crops compared to the modern varieties. It just stark mineral and nutrient differences. I think there's a specific study that I was reading, and Peruvian potato used to have a total nutrient density rank like close to 171. And now, the commercialized variety of the potato is like around 5 or something like that.
Wow.
And so, and you can look down the list at some of these ancient varieties compared to the modern varieties. And obviously, some level of development and breeding had to take effect in order to make sure that we're producing enough to feed ourselves, right? One of the cool projects that I won't go super in depth on this, but we've actually started getting back to some of those ancient grains as well. And one of those examples is the ancient oat. We started growing an ancient oat. It yields about half as much. But when you look at nutrients across the board, it's amazing the increase. You look at total Avenanthramides are over 800% higher. That's a specific secondary metabolite to the oat variety. You look at vitamin K is up over 500%, choline's up over 300%, fiber's up over 300%. So these aren't like small improvements. I always say it's not like it's a 2 to 5% increase in X amount of nutrients, right? These are huge leaps and bounds in really increasing that nutritional density. You think about things like choline in the oat variety, and choline, over 90% of America isn't consuming enough choline every day, and vitamin K. And so these nutrient deficiencies that you see across the board really start in the soil, and it's in our crops as well. And so the other thing is our crops, like I mentioned, has been bred for yield and not nutrient density. And so getting back to some of these varieties, but the absolute foundation is that soil. They can't get nutrients from anywhere but the soil. And so that's really the foundation and the backbone to growing really nutrient dense crops and making sure that we're fueling ourselves with the nutrients and the nutrition that we need.
So basically what I'm hearing is because our soil is depleted, our plants are depleted, even eating, like you were mentioning, oat, you could eat the same amount of oats that your grandparents ate, and nutrient content wise, you are not getting the same nutrition.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, you're exactly right. And that's the scary truth, right? Because now 60 to 70% of our diet is ultra processed foods, and we're relying on 30 to 40%. That's maybe whole foods. And then you look at the state of our soil and the state of the nutrients and the nutrient density of the crops that we're growing and eating. And it's almost like we don't even have a choice but to be nutrient deficient at this point. And so that's really a scary epidemic. And I think when you look at, different issues that we're dealing with across the board in the health space, a lot of this has to do with the nutrient depletion of the soil and our crops.
We'd like to take a quick moment to mention our sponsor, Standard Process. Standard Process, a family-owned company, makes high-quality, whole food-based nutritional supplements. Standard Process was a pioneer in whole food nutrition. Many of the ingredients used in the company's whole food-based supplements are grown on-site on their 850-acre certified organic farm. They're passionate about cultivating nutrient-dense soil, which maximizes the nutrient density of the plants that end up in their products. Standard Process is inspiring a new era of whole food nutrition innovation that remains dedicated to your practice, your patients, and your health. To learn more about Standard Process, visit standardprocess.com/only@sp.
Yeah. And then back to the oats, you mentioned the Avenanthramides. And I think I don't think most people know what that means. When you say Avenanthramides, what exactly is that and why are they so important?
Avenanthramides are a specific secondary metabolite that's unique to the oat variety. And you think about like a lot of these phytonutrients or secondary metabolites and or bioflavonoids and things like buckwheat and stuff like that. A lot of those things aren't reflected or talked about anywhere. And there's less emphasis on those nutrients. One of the simplest ways to kind of talk about whole foods and all of these nutrients that are important. And I bring that one up because it's unique and it's really elevated in these ancient varieties. But I bring that one up too, because it's one of those ones people don't really talk about. In buckwheat, for example, right, it has a really rich vitamin C content, but it has a really rich bioflavonoids to go along with it. Especially in the nutrition industry, all synthetic nutrients. Getting back to some of these whole food compounds that really contain not just ascorbic acid, right, but all of the nutrients that we need to really have a therapeutic effect in the body with ascorbic acid are important. I think the easiest example to go back to, right, is vitamin C versus ascorbic acid. And that one's talked about all the time. The vitamin C these days is ascorbic acid, but it's so much more than that, right? It's the vitamin P, K, and J factors. It's all those bioflavonoids and the ascorbigen that's with the vitamin C, right? And vitamin C is just the outer layer, but there's so many more things there. And so that's what's so cool about these whole foods, especially the ones that are more nutrient dense, is you're getting all of the enzymes and cofactors and minerals that you need to really use that nutrient to the fullest ability and possibility.
Yeah. So far, we've talked about magnesium and we've talked about buckwheat has vitamin K and it has vitamin C and bioflavonoids. Basically, eating buckwheat is very different than just consuming vitamin C to get your vitamin C, levels up or something, right? So this whole food concept that you're really describing, it's so much more than is shown on a label.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there's some great resources that you guys put out actually that break these things down, which I love because so oftentimes, the Color of Food series, we're just thinking about those bigger and more important nutrients.
Yep.
And so many times we forget about all the phytonutrients, right? And all of these, what used to be called unknown factors, right? And now we're discovering them more and more and all of the health benefits that go along with them. And so that's really what you get with this whole food philosophy and focus. And it's so cool to see, in Spanish black radish, tannins and those saponins and the health benefits of all those phytonutrients that are unique to different varieties of crops.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I just have such a passion, I think, for teaching patients about how to read a label because, people are just looking at those macronutrients, right? They're just like carbs, proteins, fats, take a look at some calories and they'll put themselves on, a calorie restricted diet. But the reality is nutrition is very complex and it's so much more than just something you read on a label because the label is going to miss these phytonutrients that you keep talking about, these Avenanthramides, if we're talking about oats, the magnesium and the bioflavonoids and the vitamin C, if we're talking about buckwheat and on and on. I mean, all of these different foods, you may not see these really important compounds that have health benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the cool part. Sometimes I think, we think we're smarter than nature, right? And we can, get away with designing our diet however we want or, eating ultra processed foods and things like that. And I think so many times, we forget about the other thing that's wild is like there's really only a handful of bioflavonoids that have really been really well researched, right? We talk about rutin and quercetin and we're like, holy cow, look at all of these immense health benefits of rutin and quercetin. What about the other hundreds of phytonutrients that we still really haven't looked into and researched? And I think the more that research comes out, I think it's really exciting and really shows how powerful these whole food complexes are. And it's like, man, it's almost like God put these things here for us to eat, right? It's like,
that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So we've got to get back to the basics in so many ways.
Yeah. Just talking about the farming practices we've talked about. I mean, they just sound incredible. I want to hear more too. I think people don't understand how technology plays a role in all of this because you think about a farm and I think about, someone with a rake and a shovel and digging through some dirt. So we know the soil is the foundation, but farming practices have changed, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what's really amazing, our farm, almost 900 acres of certified organic, and there's about 4 people that run it. And we're constantly planting and harvesting because we have a very different approach to farming and harvesting, the cultivation piece, right, is what's so labor intensive when you're farming organically. And so you might have to cultivate a crop 2 or 3 times, but we now have, our tractors have GPS. We can lock in on a GPS grid and, don't have to touch the wheel and be cultivating a field. We utilize different cultivators out of Germany. I feel like over in Europe and Germany and things like that, like they often tend to cultivate more and rely less on glyphosate and genetically modified crops. They have a lot better technology when it comes to cultivators. From an organic perspective, we have tremendous technology. We have different implements that have camera guided systems on it. They actually identify where the row of crops is, and they hydraulically automatically will move back and forth within the row to make sure that you're not taking out certain crops. That's really cool technology. You can be running GPS from when you plant a crop, but then when you come back to cultivate, you can use that same GPS line, get on there, and then have your cultivator be automatically adjusting based on a camera system. The other thing that's been really labor intensive for us on our farm is we do a lot of transplanting of different crops, Brussels sprouts, kale, a new crop called mountain spinach. And so we have to transplant those where it actually takes like 7 people, 1 person driving the tractor, 4 people sit on the back of the implement. And as this carousel moves around, you're dropping transplants into the carousel. And then you have 2 people walking behind, grabbing trays and refreshing and things like that. Wow. Very labor intensive process. You're planting at about 0.4 miles an hour. And then we used to have it where you'd have to come back and cultivate that way too. And so we had what was called a Regi weeder, and 4 people would sit on the back of that, and you'd move the implements around every crop to get in between the row, because you have cultivators that get in between the rows, but not in between the plants in the row. And so transplants are planted a little bit farther apart. To be able to cultivate between the crops in the row is really an important thing as well. And so now we have some German technology as well that actually has a camera guided system on it, and it's got 4 wands, and they identify this crop. We're cultivating mountain spinach today. It's 6 inches tall. It's got a purple leaf, and the camera actually identifies where each individual crop is, and the wands will swipe around every crop automatically. And you can cultivate up to like 2 miles an hour with that implement and just 1 person. And so technology has really made it more doable on our farm. And definitely as we grow and expand and plant more of certain varieties of crops, that technology has definitely made it more able to do that.
Touch quite a bit on this nutrient piece. How about preserving nutrition after a plant is harvested? What do we do about that? We hear about this all the time and go to the supermarket and it's like, eat your foods fresh and eat your veggies fresh and do all of this. But what does that look like from a farming standpoint?
Yeah, the average food travels like 1,000 miles to your plate. It's frozen a lot of times and things like that. And you don't know how it's handled really after the process. All of our crops are either going into juice extracts or they're being dried for ingredients. Really how we do that is we plant to harvest. A lot of farms, they'll plant, all their crops in the spring and harvest them all in the fall. And we do successive planting. And so we can harvest little bits of crops at a time. We're only planting to how we can manufacture.
Gotcha. You really have to harvest, these crops, like you said. So now we're looking for the nutrient density. So that could be when the plant is large or medium or small, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with the nutrient density, right? How do we know, when is the nutrition right? And what are we looking for in these different plants?
Yeah, it can depend on the variety or the crop, but typically buckwheat, for example, it's most nutrient dense, especially for a juice extract before it goes to seed, when it's fully mature, but before it starts to really put all of its energy and nutrients into the reproductive stage. So you want to get the crops during that period of time. So we have to time it out, right? And so when you're planting, you have to figure, okay, this crop's going to be most nutrient dense in 8 to 10 weeks. And so you have to be able to come back and harvest at that point. But then, if you can only process little chunks of the field at a time, you got to kind of plan that out.
Yeah, that's, again, kind of back to the practices. It sounds like such a planning, a lot of labor, obviously, that goes into this. It sounds like an incredible amount of planning in order to make all of these. We're selecting for this nutrient dense crop, and then we have to harvest this crop. And then, you're making this juice extract. What are you doing to make a juice extract? You just press it when you pull it out of the field?
So after we harvest, and we plant to harvest and manufacture. And so when we're doing our juicing, we can maybe juice 150,000 pounds of buckwheat in a day. And so that's about 6 wagons. So we'll go out and we'll chop 6 wagons, and each wagon's about, 25,000 pounds. And we'll juice that, press that material. And then you have the dried pulp material that's left over that we compost. And then we take that juice extract and we dry it on what's called a refractance window dryer. And so it's a very delicate drying technology that we use. It works on a bed of water. And so we run a belt across a bed of water and we apply a really thin layer of juice extract to the top of the belt. And it's dried within 2 to 8 minutes. That's the other thing that really improves the nutrient density, is that really gentle drying process and limiting that time under temperature. That's really the key to nutrient preservation. To get back to the freshness, that's where it all starts. You harvest the crop that morning in the field and you're juicing it literally like you drive the tractor and the wagon right into the juicing facility. So it's pressed and your extract isn't sitting, in a barrel. Your crop's not sitting outside for a few days. So that's really how we maximize the nutrient value of our crops.
I think people don't maybe truly understand how important it is looking at maybe temperatures. Like you said, if you can pick something that day and process it and put it into a form that can retain those nutrients, I think that's just so important and probably undervalued.
If you spend decades rebuilding your soil regeneratively, and then you breed crops for higher nutrient value, and your focus is this, but then you throw a crop on a really high heat dryer, you can just degrade all of those nutrients. And then all the work that you just did is kind of all for naught. What's commonly used throughout the industry is an atmospheric double drum dryer. And this can be a higher heat process, can be a longer duration, and where you're really degrading a lot of these compounds like chlorophyll and vitamin E and more of these heat sensitive nutrients. Rutin and quercetin as bioflavonoids, just to name a few. And so we have invested in this refractance window drying technology. And basically how this works is it's a hotbed of water and we run a belt across the top of it and we apply a thin layer of extract to the top of the belt. And as that runs across, it dries between 2 to 8 minutes. And so it's really fast. And so the benefit here comes from limiting the time under temperature again. And that ends up producing, like, you look at chlorophyll is almost 11 times higher on that dryer compared to an atmospheric double drum. The levels of rutin and quercetin are both elevated. All of those compounds that are really heat sensitive seem to be a lot higher in these compounds when we dry them on the RWD dryer. So really unique technology that it's not the cheapest and the most efficient in the world, but as far as preserving nutrient value, that's what you really get with the RWD dryer. And so really cool to be utilizing those juice extracts too, because a lot of people, when they talk about, crops like buckwheat, like how unique that is that we're actually drying down that juice powder and not just the grain. And buckwheat's getting more popular. More and more companies are talking about the benefits of buckwheat, Himalayan tartary buckwheat and things like that. But it's really that juice concentrate that's, includes all those bioflavonoids, the vitamin C, all of those factors that we talked about earlier that are really therapeutic. And so it's important, no one's out there eating fresh buckwheat. They're eating the grain, right? The buckwheat groats. And so that's what's really unique to be able to provide. And it has a lot different phytonutrient profile and it delivers different nutrients to the body.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And patients, they'll say something if they're looking at a buckwheat supplement, for instance, and they'll say, I should just eat buckwheat. If you're just taking this buckwheat grain and you're processing it and put mortar and pestle, so to speak, and putting it in a supplement that way, that's not what you're talking about here.
No, these are really highly concentrated nutrients. When you take like a bottle of a certain supplement, it can equate to 30 cups of raw vegetables and raw leafy greens. And it's like, when you consider that, right, most people probably aren't eating 30 cups of green leafy vegetables in a year, right? And so these are really highly concentrated extracts where you're getting a lot more potent nutrient compounds.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And I think that's just really important for when you're looking at nutrition, just because something says, unless you're looking at that extract, like you said, you're really looking for the specific phytonutrient profile, like a powerful nutrients.
Yeah, really important there. And to be coming from a good source. And that's where, I would just encourage everyone really to be looking at their local organic co-ops and and really partnering with either local farms or really just investing in that organic produce, right? Because we've got to get back to, supporting those local farmers and getting your crops from farmers that are practicing regenerative agriculture. And the more that we can support them, the more people will start to really farm that way.
Yeah. Speaking of which, how open are farms or farmers? How transparent should they be? I mean, it seems like you're really telling me, you're giving me all of this information. Is this something that you want everyone to hear? Is it about these farming practices? You're open about the practices that your farm kind of engages in and what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do try throughout the local, Wisconsin area and in any of these different events that we can educate on what we do on the farm, because a lot of people ask us, how are you doing it without pesticides and synthetic fertilizers? And how are you getting away with this? How are you not losing crops? And so we do educate to some extent. I think that's where we could get out there more on podcasts like this and really tell this story and inspire others to farm regeneratively and transition to farming. There is a big barrier to entry, right? If you buy a conventional farm, you have to farm it organically for 3 years and sell your produce conventionally until you convert it to organic. And so it is a barrier to entry for other farms. But it really, I think, is the way that we've got to kind of swing back the organic way for sure.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, just educating people about this and having them understand that if I knew something was being farmed organically, and they were in year 2 or year 3, I would maybe buy that, even though it's maybe a conventional product, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of, there's this really cool series up and coming. It's called the Whole Systems Nutrition Symposium. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, Jack, but it is going to be on October the 24th. It's a virtual symposia, and it is going to cover a lot of what we just covered today. So things like soil science, things like seed selection, microbial diversity, how important that is. This symposia is designed to help healthcare practitioners really address modern nutritional challenges. And there'll be numerous speakers, but if that's something you're interested in, that would be bridging that gap, what we've talked about today, going into more detail, how to help our patients really become healthy from the soil all the way to ultimate health. So that's something that we can definitely link for our listeners.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. Some of those speakers are going to be absolutely phenomenal and really expand on this topic that we touched on today. So really excited to be on that one myself, and a lot of great, exciting things coming soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jack DuBois, thank you so much for joining us today on the Holistic Matters podcast. It's really been an honor to be here with you today, and you're just a wealth of knowledge, certainly an expert in regenerative agriculture, and we'll look forward, to doing this again sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Parent. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Tune in every first and third Thursday for new Holistic Matters episodes. And be sure to like and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Remember to visit holisticmatters.com for a wide range of holistic health content to keep you up to date on the latest nutrition science and herbal health trends. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and a special thank you to our sponsor, Standard Process. Thank you for listening. Visit holisticmatters.com for more content, and remember, that's holistic with a W.